Hello, welcome to the LaRouchePAC Weekly Report for February the 29th, 2012. I'm John Hoefle, and with me in the studio today are Cody Jones and Sky Shields of The Basement and Lyndon LaRouche.
Now, we run into a problem with that because, as you'll see in this animation, here we have depicted just sort of a general, the general nature of that kind of idea. The bigger pink cone here, that represents our general anti-entropic baseline of the system. As we've discussed before, the universe, the biosphere, is always moving. It's always developing. So you've got a certain baseline where if we, as human beings, want to continue ourselves to thrive and grow, we have to at least meet the requirement of the baseline of growth. And it's not just growth simply in terms of more, it's growth in terms of change. It's always developing. So if you try to fix your activity to one fixed mode of action, all the things that you're depending on for your existence are themselves changing. You know, like the climate. I mean, there is climate change. There's always been climate change. The fact that there is climate change is not then reason to then say, well, we have to somehow arbitrarily determine what is the ideal climate and figure out how to change our activity to maintain that ideal climate. No, we recognize the system is always changing. How do we organize our activity to at least meet the requirements of that change, if not actually supersede it to organize it to an even higher order of change? But the oligarchical system will say, no, we've got to push, we've got to start to conserve, we've got to reduce our growth. The effect of that is that as you sort of try to push your horizon point forward, you actually reach a point where your activity drops below the baseline of activity of the biosphere as a whole. And you actually reach a point of collapse. You start to collapse. As you're trying to push the inevitable away from you, in fact, what you're doing is you're pushing yourself into a collapse point. Now, you counterpose that kind of an idea to what we've discussed before as the actual nature of the biosphere. As you see in just this diagram, this still diagram, the actual nature of the development of life on the planet has always been one of anti-entropic growth, where each system, in effect, which is dominated by a certain type of animal life, a certain type of plant life, a certain climate, etc., you have a certain state of the biosphere, is always superseded by a higher state, a more dynamic state, a more complex state, one which introduces new, in effect, revolutions in the condition of the biology of life. The previous system goes out of existence, collapses. That's where you get these extinctions, but to be superseded by a higher order system. So we know that the actual natural condition of the evolution of the biosphere, that actually is reflecting the system as a whole, meaning the galactic and universal system, is always one of growth, of expansion, of development. Whenever we act contrary to that, we reach that kind of collapse point. We reach that breakdown point, as we showed there. Now, unfortunately, and this is something, just to make the point, here's another still, which sort of, just by the implication of what's included in the diagram, what Vernadsky has discussed was that the nature of this growth process is that on the one hand, you can measure it in terms of a constant increase in the flux of energy through the system, but you also measure it in terms of the constant, what he called the increase in the biogenic migration of atoms. That the flow of material through the system, the rate of flow, is always increasing. Whether it's iron, whether it's calcium, whatever, the rate of flow is always increasing through the system. So that's how we should always be thinking. How do we increase the rate of flow of the materials that we're consuming through the system to push ourselves forward? To not do that is to embrace death, to embrace extinction. Now here's just some quick diagrams just to kind of give you a sense of, well, what have we been doing? What has been the policy of the United States relative to, say, iron? Well, here you see, since 1960, the United States, in terms of our consumption of, this has different things, primary metals, other things, but we'll just look at the primary metals. Since 1960, we've actually overall collapsed and flatlined in terms of our consumption of metals. If you look at it per capita, it's even more stark. If you look at this purple line here, which is primary metals, since 1960 per capita, you've actually had a net collapse in the per capita consumption of metals like iron ore. So if you sort of look at the trend in the United States, really since, as we've pinpointed, the assassination of Kennedy, that period, you look from 1900 up till about 1960 or so, it was a steady increase in our use of non-renewable metals, or what we consider not iron, etc. Right? A constant increase. That's a growth function. All of a sudden, around the mid-1960s, we have a little dip and we flatline. Right? We embrace this idea of limited resources, environmentalism, conservationism, and we flatline. We no longer are growing. So we stop growing. Now, just to give you another idea of this, while the United States embraced that conception, here is the consumption of materials since the 1970s, basically a flat line. The rest of the world has been on a trajectory of wanting to grow, of increase. This gives you a certain idea, at least a snapshot of why people want to understand, well, why are we now going to war with China, wanting to go to war with Russia? How does this relate to what you guys are discussing in the domain of science? How does this relate to all this discussion of the biosphere? Well, you think about the way the oligarchy works. Here is just a, kind of hard to see this, but this gives you an idea of, this is the trend line for Russia, of China over that same period. Actually, this is from 1980 to 2005. If you look at their trend line, over that period we saw in the United States was a flat trend line of consumption, which was actually a per capita reduction of consumption. China, on the other hand, has had a trajectory of hyperbolic growth in the consumption of steel, copper, building materials. Now, the enemy looks at that and says, that's what we have to take out. They say, look, they're growing. We can't have a system where we're collapsing, our system's collapsing, but some other potential counterparty is growing, is developing, is industrializing. We look at China, they're talking about 100 new cities of 1 million people. They're pushing their space program forward. They're going full thrust with moving towards a nuclear economy. So the oligarchy says, that's the enemy, that's the target. We can't allow a growing system to try to exist while we're intentionally trying to collapse our system. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at these different trend lines, you have a sense of what some of the dynamic that's behind this insane war drive, behind this idea of while we're moving fleets into the Pacific, while we're trying to antagonize Russia and China through the Syrian-Iranian operation. It's part of this oligarchical intention to destroy civilization. Now, the counter to that is what we've been pushing, which is actually, let me see if we have this here. We'll get it. You'll see, what you're going to see eventually is you're going to see an animation that depicts what should be the policy. Where now we start to realize that how do we start to think about what should be our activity today? If we think from the oligarchical standpoint, which is the second law of thermodynamics, which is environmentalism, you're always thinking from the standpoint of the past. How do we preserve the past? How do we preserve our relationship to the past? As opposed to what we're saying is that no, a credit system says, what's the future? Where could mankind be? We could be developing the moon. We could be moving towards the colonization of Mars. We could be building things like Nawapa to address, the fact that, for example, in 2009, the report card that's put out by the civil engineers of America gave American infrastructure a D. Right? Drinking water got a D-. Energy got a D+. And they said we have a $2.2 trillion deficit that we would have to put in over the next 5 years. That's just to maintain even the existing baseline. That doesn't even include real growth, which we would be pushing for. So how do we get to this future state, which is the idea of man in the stars, the idea of creating real, healthy, basic living conditions for all human beings? real health care, enough food to eat, shelter, clean water, I mean, basic necessities. That's saying, okay, we know where we could be. That now is basic, that now the future now acts on what was the previous state of, say, the iron deposits to create the present. That the present is never something in and of itself. It's always looking at how the future acts on the past to redefine really the past, to create our current moment. When you do that, you actually get an opposite trend, where instead of trying to reduce your consumption of things like iron ore, you actually accelerate the consumption. And accelerating it under the right policy to say, hey, we're going to consume more iron ore because we're going to be building Nawapa. We're going to be building nuclear power plants all over the place. The lunatic or the person who doesn't know economics might say, well, isn't that going to bring us closer to this collapse point? Isn't that going to bring us closer to the point we run out of resources? When the reality is, in doing that, you in fact redefine a whole new resource base. Once you move towards, say, a full nuclear economy, now you're able to actually transmutate and create new resources through the nuclear process. Once you start being able to leave the bounds of Earth itself, you start realizing, hey, we can mine the asteroid belts. We can mine the moon. We open up a whole new domain of accessible resources, so to speak, because of really this creative function of mankind. Whenever man acts from the future, he actually pushes the creative principle of the mind, which is always redefining any kind of boundary that you might find. And that's really where we have to move things. If the United States, if the world is going to rescue itself from this current extinction phase, because we really are moving towards an extinction, whether through actual just physical collapse, biological and physical collapse, but then also the fact that the reaction to that crisis on the part of the oligarchy is to move us towards war, is to move us towards a self-induced extinction through thermonuclear war. The way out of that is to revolutionize our thinking about our relationship to the biosphere and our relationship to time. To now say the future is what must determine our activity today. That the present is always the relationship between a creative, imaginative intention for the future acting on the past, in a sense, to define a generated state of the present. You're always generating the present from the future. And that's how I think we'll come to realize that all processes in the universe, from the abiotic to the biotic to noetic, are always operating from the future, is actually what's defining anything that you might identify in the present. And so I just want to throw that picture out there, and maybe we can open it up for some discussion here.
We can. The problem involves attacking certain false presumptions. One is the notion of the human individual, as defined as the human individual. That the assumption that the human individual has everything contained within them, their willpower, their perspective, and so forth, which is false. Because actually the human individual's behavior is socially induced as a social process. That's the number one error. Also, we are an integral part of the universe, physically, in terms of real physics. So that we are predominantly a living process, and as we know in the case of humanity, not only are we a living process, which animals are, for example, but human beings are not animals, except often they choose to behave like them. The human being is actually a creative force. Only human beings have the ability to create new states of existence by will. No other species has ever been able to do that. There's no knowledge of that. But then you have a difference among people. You have people who are conditioned to believe that they are animals. Same old, same old. That's an animal. Who becomes an animal? The victims of the oligarchy. Who becomes an animal? The people who are told they are animals, unlike the ruling gods above them, the oligarchical system. As far as we know, in civilization so far as an actual dialogue of people with people on these questions. What we know is that the problem here is you have two general classes, which are not just social classes in the crude sense, but they're actually a division in the way people evolve. the intellectual functions evolve. Some people believe that it's better not to change. Some people believe in the same old system as their destiny. And other people who are the rulers believe that the same old system is what they have to administer to enable to control the population in general. So what you get is you get a developmental process in the human mind. And the only thing that has a mind of that type is human beings. We don't know of anything else, any living creature that has that thing. Think of how few people in the total population actually are creative. A very tiny part of the total population is actually functionally creative, willfully functionally creative. You have some people who, in a certain degree, respond to the influence of creativity by others. But you have some people who stick in the mud of non-creativity. And what the dope addict is doing, the marijuana freak is doing, is actually killing their mind in order to suppress their conflict with the reality of progress.
Yeah.
It erupts. They are compelled to progress. They're compelled to develop. They're compelled to invent. And they resent that. They want to have the comfort of the old sock that never was washed. And they find that blessing in marijuana or similar kinds of dope. So the problem is we don't understand in the sense of society's leadership, does not understand currently the meaning of what a human being is. That's where the problem lies. We are actually, mankind demonstrates this in power systems. When we go to the actual use of fission, now fission exists, right? But the use of fission as a power was a recent development. Now we go to thermonuclear fusion, fission and then thermonuclear fusion. Then we go to matter-antimatter reactions. These are, we correlate these things with what? We correlate the things with the ordinary fission structures, with the thermonuclear fusion processes. We are now actually engaging experimentally in the matter-antimatter processes. We're actually engaging in that now. We don't have the mastery of it we'd like to brag about, but we actually have an awareness of this. And this is obviously not the limit of the universe. There are other things which I know of, just from my work, that there are aspects of the nature of the human being's mind in the universe as a whole, which are very little understood. And we know there are reaches beyond this which mankind can attain. And what does this mean? When we can go to a rate of flying to Mars within 1 week from Earth or from the Moon, which is a thermonuclear fusion capability properly used, we are also going to matter-antimatter things. We are now dealing with matter-antimatter processes. And there are processes beyond that which we have yet to really define. So therefore mankind's ability is to create a recognition and utilization of these higher degrees of power of mankind's existence, and to change the universe willfully in a way necessary for human destiny. And therefore what happens is we become conditioned. So generation after generation have become, since Kennedy was assassinated, become more and more stupid, generation by generation, and stratum by stratum. And therefore you have a dehumanizing process which has taken over. And what we're seeing the management from the beginning of the oligarchical system as we know it, where some people treated other people as animals and denied them the right to express anything. Even the idea of mankind should not have the right to use fire. This issue, that mankind is the only creature which willfully uses fire. No other creature, living creature that we know of, uses fire as a willful choice. Most people are not allowed to use fire in more than the crudest way. And this bounds man. It also conditions mankind so that the majority of populations accept the imperial system, in which a small oligarchy imposes its will by imposing stupidity on the mass of the people. And then periodically, when the people become excessive in numbers, from the standpoint of the oligarchy, they kill them off. So the British monarchy, the British Queen, and her whole apparatus have said they've now declared the human population must be reduced from 7 billion people to less than 1 billion people. And they're on the road to do it. And then you have all these silly people who believe in environmentalism. They're brainwashed. They're zombies. Nobody but a zombie could believe in zero growth, except the oligarchy who believes that they have to use zero growth as a way of controlling the population. So the zero growther is either evil or stupid. And they cannot be trusted with fire of any kind. So that's our problem. We are dealing with, we have to recognize that the idea of mankind is something which is plucked into, like a colonist, into the universe. Mankind is an integral part of the forces of the universe. And we're finding that more and more. Look, when we discover the meaning of fission, as opposed to discovering the effect of fission, when we discover thermonuclear fusion, when we discover the antimatter principle and recognize today that the antimatter principle is the most important factor in the functioning of this whole damn universe, even the solar system. And ordinary people don't recognize that. So we realize that mankind and mankind's creative powers as a mind, with a mind, it is something that affects the universe. So we're not an object within the universe, we're an integral, functional part of the universe. And our capabilities are a functional part of the way the universe works. That evidence is to all of us who know these things, recognize this as clear. So therefore we don't recognize, by ignoring these factors, we don't recognize what we're dealing with. Mankind has a potential which is far beyond anything that the great majority of humanity has any inkling of. Right. We'll take the comparison of the ancient Egyptian pyramids, the Grand Pyramid, the Grand Pyramid. And this was which involved, they were not slaves. They could not have done that as slaves. This was they actually had workshops and residences at the base of the Great Pyramid region. And the build-up was done by a technology which was superior to the technology used in generations later, 1,000 years later, and so forth. So what we're dealing with here is exactly that point, is that human creativity is a natural condition of humanity. And when human beings are not being creative, they're not being fully human. And so you have this progress in society of generations, which are progressive generations, and though declining generations. And it's always this conflict between creativity and the oligarchy. The object today is reached the point that mankind cannot live safely on a planet or in this solar system under the rule of an oligarchy. The oligarchical system must be destroyed. Yeah. Because if it's not destroyed, as we see now with the threat of the thermonuclear war hovering over us right now, on any day nearby, it is now possible and even increasingly likely that a thermonuclear war will burst out from which even perhaps no human being will survive. If this is the situation. Therefore, since this condition, which is represented by the British Empire, which is actually an empire, a world empire, we can no longer tolerate the existence of this system, the oligarchical system on this planet. We can no longer tolerate oligarchical imperial systems because the risk is so great now that the very existence of such systems in their desperate condition today threatens the extinction of the human species. And there, mankind, which is fit to be called mankind, is going to eliminate that oligarchical system now because we reached the point we can no longer tolerate its presence.
In particular, if we're going to be trusted with more intensive types of power, like matter and antimatter technologies, a humanity that still has an oligarchy attached to it cannot be entrusted with that kind of development.
They have a weapon in thermonuclear fusion now to destroy the human species. And it's likely, because what's going to happen, the British are now going to push for extinction. They're going to threaten it, hoping that they can get total control of the planet. They see China and Russia and some India, of the countries of Asia in particular, as being a source of threat to the oligarchical system, because those nations cannot exist under the conditions of the oligarchical system. So the British and so forth are going to threaten what? That the whole world submit to the oligarchical principle. Otherwise, we're going to blow your heads off with thermonuclear power. And therefore, we have to eliminate thermonuclear power as in the hands of an oligarchy. But you can't do that unless you eliminate the oligarchy. Therefore, the British Empire has to be broken up. Because the British Empire cannot function with its weapon system against the world unless it controls the United States president. And anybody who supports Obama, who is the British agent behind this, is actually committing treason against the human race. However, whatever their excuse is, cheap or otherwise. This system must be eliminated now. We have to go back to a system of sovereign nation states among people who are engaged in joint projects of mutual concern, and go on to the conquest of the solar system, which we're prepared to do. We've got to restore man to what mankind really is, not some poor slug who's kissing the rump of some oligarch. And I think there's a possibility. We have, in the United States, we've seen some resistance to the Obama threat, which is really the British threat. Standing up, is been the block. We could have been in a thermonuclear conflict before the last year, already.
That was the intent.
That was the intent. And it's the courage of some people, including in our system, who resisted that, which postponed that, as opposed to all those politicians who are kissing the butt of Obama right now. And the kissing the butt of Obama is the incendiary device which will set off the destruction of civilization. So what we're really dealing with is the question of what is the nature of mankind in the universe, and how do we protect mankind in what we now know to be the expression of its natural function within the universe. How do we get rid of the oligarchical tradition and develop citizens who are in pride of what they are as human beings, and do the kinds of things we know have to be done?
Yeah.